The worst punishments in the history of the Bible. Imagine living in a time where breaking the law, or even standing up for your beliefs, could mean the most excruciating punishment. The Bible doesn't shy away from telling stories of suffering. But what were the most brutal torture methods in the Bible? Number 1. The awful eye torture. Imagine witnessing the execution of your children, the light of your life, only to have your own eyes taken away moments later, leaving that horrific image as your last memory forever. This wasn't the plot of a fictional horror story. It was a real punishment carried out by one of the most powerful kings in history, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Today, we're diving into one of the Bible's most chilling accounts ever. In the middle of Mesopotamia, between two big rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates, at the south of Baghdad, currently known as Iraq, there was a fantastic city named Babylon. And the king of Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar. He was a great man. Historians believe that his city had a fantastic garden that was like a giant green building in the sky, known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. People called it one of the 7 wonders of the old times. A man known for his ambition, brilliance, and brutality. By the time he turned his attention to Jerusalem, the city had already been weakened by years of conflict. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't satisfied with just conquering cities. He wanted to utterly break those who opposed him. Enter Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. Zedekiah had made a critical mistake. He rebelled against Babylon after swearing an oath of loyalty. To Nebuchadnezzar, this wasn't just disobedience, it was an insult. And if there's one thing Nebuchadnezzar didn't tolerate, it was being disrespected. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, a brutal campaign that lasted over a year. Food supplies ran out. People starved. The walls of the city were breached, and the Babylonian army poured in like a flood. For Zedekiah, the writing was on the wall. His reign was over. But instead of surrendering, he fled under the cover of night. He didn't get far. Babylonian soldiers captured Zedekiah near Jericho and brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, who was waiting in Riblah. And this is where the story takes a dark, almost unbearable turn. Imagine the terror Zedekiah must have felt, knowing he was at the mercy of one of the most ruthless rulers in history. Nebuchadnezzar didn't waste time. He ordered Zedekiah's sons, his legacy, his hope for the future, to be executed right in front of him. The Bible says in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 7, "And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes." As if that weren't horrifying enough, Nebuchadnezzar ensured this was the last thing Zedekiah would ever see. Moments after watching his sons die, Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out on Nebuchadnezzar's command. It wasn't just a punishment, it was psychological warfare. The king of Babylon wanted to send a message. Rebellion comes at a cost, and mercy was not in his vocabulary. Zedekiah was then bound in bronze shackles and taken to Babylon, where he lived the rest of his days in captivity, blind, broken, and haunted by his final memory, a father's worst nightmare. So why did Nebuchadnezzar choose such a horrifying punishment? In ancient times, kings often used public displays of brutality to crush rebellion and instill fear. By blinding Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar was making sure no one in Judah would dare challenge Babylonian rule again. But there's also a deeper, spiritual layer to this story. This wasn't just a political punishment. It was a fulfillment of prophecy. The prophet Ezekiel had warned Zedekiah, saying, "I will bring him to Babylon, yet he shall not see it, though he shall die there." Ezekiel chapter 12, verse 13. It's chilling how accurately this prophecy came to pass. Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, but he never saw the city because his eyes were taken from him. This moment wasn't just about Nebuchadnezzar's wrath. It was a reminder of the consequences of ignoring God's warnings. The story of Zedekiah is one of tragedy, but it's also a call to humility and obedience. While Nebuchadnezzar's actions were cruel, they remind us of the weight of our choices and the importance of staying aligned with God's will. So, let's learn from this ancient king's mistakes. Seek God, trust His word, and remember that even in the darkest moments, His mercy is still available to those who turn back to Him. Number 2. The fiery furnace. Here we remain with King Nebuchadnezzar and his fiery furnace. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a test of courage, belief, and divine intervention. After all his conquering, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be worshipped. So, he did what any megalomaniac king might do. He built a massive golden statue, towering 90 feet high, and commanded everyone to bow before it. But not everyone obeyed. Among the crowd were 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow. They served the God of Israel and wouldn't worship any other, no matter the cost. And trust me, the cost was about to be unimaginably high. Word of their defiance reached Nebuchadnezzar, and he was furious. In Daniel 3:13, the Bible says the king, in rage and fury, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. Now, imagine the scene. The most powerful man in the world, towering over you, demanding that you obey or face death by fire. Most people would have crumbled under the pressure. But these 3 men stood firm. When Nebuchadnezzar threatened them, they replied with words that still inspire courage today. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us. But even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 to 18. Now, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just angry, he was enraged. This wasn't just a campfire. It was like an industrial furnace, likely used for smelting metals. These are known to reach temperatures of over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that into perspective, that's hotter than the surface of Venus. This wasn't just a punishment. It was psychological warfare. The sight and sound of the roaring flames were meant to instill fear and absolute obedience. Standing near it, the heat alone would have felt suffocating, like standing too close to an open oven, but multiplied by 100. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow, Nebuchadnezzar's rage reached its peak. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than normal, an impossible heat meant to destroy instantly. Even the soldiers tasked with throwing the men into the furnace were killed by the extreme heat. Imagine the terror of those moments, the roaring flames, the blistering heat radiating out, and the knowledge that stepping inside would mean instant, agonizing death. So, how would it have felt to step into a furnace like that? At temperatures over 1,800 degrees, your skin would begin to burn almost immediately. The air itself would feel like needles piercing every inch of your body. Breathing would be impossible. Every gasp would scorch your lungs. Even standing near the flames would cause severe burns. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't just stand near the furnace. They were thrown inside. The fear, the physical pain, and the overwhelming heat should have been unbearable. And yet, something miraculous happened. Instead of screams, there was silence. Instead of death, there was life. Nebuchadnezzar himself looked into the furnace and saw something incredible. Not 3 men, but 4. The fourth figure, glowing with a heavenly radiance, looked like the Son of God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were walking in the fire as if it were a gentle breeze. Not a hair on their heads was burned, and they didn't even smell like smoke when they came out. This was more than a miracle. It was a declaration of God's power and presence. The fiery furnace wasn't just brutal because of its heat. It was designed to humiliate, terrify, and erase any trace of rebellion. For Nebuchadnezzar, it was a statement of absolute power. But for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it became the ultimate test of faith. Their refusal to bow wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a declaration that their God was greater than the flames, greater than the king, and greater than fear itself. Number 3. The Lion's Den. Now we remain in Babylon, but under a different king. Imagine being thrown into a pit of hungry lions. The sounds of growling echo around you, their eyes glinting in the dark as they circle closer. Your heart races, your breath catches. What happens next seems inevitable. But one man faced this unimaginable terror and walked away, untouched. What made the lion's den so brutal? And how did it feel to be inside? Let's uncover this gripping story. The story of the lion's den begins with Daniel, a man known for his unwavering faith and integrity. Living in Babylon under King Darius, Daniel had risen to a position of power and respect. But his success stirred up jealousy among the other officials. They plotted against him, convincing the king to pass a law that anyone who prayed to anyone other than the king would be thrown into the lion's den. It was a trap, and they knew Daniel wouldn't compromise his faith. Let's take a closer look at what made the lion's den such a terrifying and brutal punishment. It wasn't just about the physical environment. It was a combination of fear, psychological torment, and the sheer force of nature embodied by the lions themselves. First, imagine the sensory overload. The smell of the den, thick, musty air mixed with the sharp scent of animal fur and the metallic tang of dried blood. The sound of claws scraping against stone, or the deep rumble of a lion's growl reverberating through the enclosed space. For the condemned, these sensations would have been overwhelming, triggering an instinctual fear that's almost impossible to resist. These animals weren't just hungry. They were purposefully conditioned to be as dangerous as possible. In the ancient world, lions symbolized unmatched power and savagery, often reserved for the most severe punishments. A lion's physical prowess is staggering. We're talking about an animal that can weigh up to 500 pounds, leap 36 feet in a single bound, and deliver a swipe of its paw strong enough to crush a skull. Imagine facing even one of these creatures, let alone an entire den filled with them. And yet, the lions weren't the most dangerous thing in that pit. The true terror came from the helplessness, the knowledge that there was nothing you could do to escape or fight back. You were completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. But what made this punishment so uniquely brutal wasn't just the physical danger. It was the emotional and psychological weight. For Daniel, being thrown into the lion's den wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement. His enemies weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to make an example of him, to break his spirit and destroy his faith. They wanted him to doubt the God he trusted so completely. And for King Darius, who cared deeply for Daniel, the lion's den was a nightmare of his own. Though he had been tricked into signing the decree, he was powerless to stop it. Imagine the emotional whirlwind: fear, anger, maybe even a moment of doubt. Would you feel abandoned? Would you second-guess your decision to pray, knowing this would be the price? Or would you feel a strange sense of peace, knowing your faith is stronger than any danger. And then came the moment of no return. As Daniel was lowered into the den, he would have felt the chill of the stone walls, the oppressive weight of the air around him. The lions, sensing a new presence, would have stirred, growling louder, circling closer, their glowing eyes fixed on their next victim. But then, something miraculous happened. Instead of pouncing, the lions stopped. Their growls faded. One by one, they lay down, as if some unseen force had calmed them. Can you imagine the relief Daniel must have felt in that moment? And then, the realization hit him. God was there. He wasn't alone in that pit. God had sent his angel, and the very creatures meant to destroy him had been rendered harmless. What an extraordinary moment of peace in the face of terror. The Bible doesn't give us every detail of what Daniel experienced in the den, but we can imagine the roller coaster of emotions: terror, relief, awe, and gratitude. The quiet sound of lions breathing, the stillness of the den, the palpable presence of God. It must have been both humbling and overwhelming. While Daniel was in the den, King Darius was spending a sleepless night in his palace. He was deeply distressed, knowing that he had allowed himself to be manipulated into sentencing an innocent man to such a brutal fate. Darius couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't escape the guilt of what he had done. Meanwhile, in the den, Daniel was experiencing the peace that surpasses all understanding. The kind of peace that only comes from trusting in God. Number 4. The cross. It's a symbol recognized worldwide, the cross. But behind its meaning of redemption lies a horrifying reality. The cross wasn't just an instrument of execution. It was a brutal, excruciatingly painful device designed to maximize suffering. But why was it so brutal? And what did it feel like to hang on the cross? Stay with us, because this is a story of unimaginable pain and unstoppable love. To understand the brutality of the cross, we need to look at its purpose. Crucifixion wasn't just about execution. It was about humiliation and deterrence. The Romans reserved it for the worst criminals, rebels, traitors, and slaves. The process was designed to make a statement. Victims were often crucified in public places, left hanging for hours or even days as a warning to others. It wasn't just a punishment. It was psychological warfare. And at the heart of this barbaric practice was an unrelenting desire to inflict maximum pain. For Jesus, the brutality began long before the nails were driven into his hands. After being betrayed and arrested, he was subjected to a night of physical and emotional torment. First, he was flogged, a process so savage it's hard to put into words. Roman whips, known as flagellum, were embedded with sharp pieces of bone and metal. With each strike, the whip tore into his skin, ripping it open and leaving his back shredded. Many didn't even survive this stage of crucifixion. Then came the crown of thorns. The soldiers twisted thorny branches into a mock crown and jammed it onto his head. Blood streamed down his face as they struck him and spat on him, mocking him as King of the Jews. And after all this, he was forced to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of execution, Golgotha, the place of the skull. At Golgotha, the real horror began. Crucifixion involved nailing the victim to the cross, a process that was as painful as it was cruel. Large iron nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms, to support the weight of the body. The nails pierced through nerves, sending searing pain through the arms and hands. Next, the feet were nailed to the vertical beam, either side by side or one on top of the other. the pain would have been indescribable. And yet, this was only the beginning of the suffering. Hanging on the cross was a slow, agonizing death. The weight of the body pulled down on the outstretched arms, causing dislocated shoulders and excruciating pain with every movement. Breathing became a battle. To inhale, the victim had to push up on their nailed feet, causing unbearable pain in the legs. Over time, exhaustion set in, making it nearly impossible to lift the body. Slowly, the chest muscles would paralyze, and suffocation became inevitable. But it wasn't just the physical pain. Imagine the emotional and spiritual weight Jesus carried. The crowd mocked him, the religious leaders sneered, and even the thieves crucified beside him hurled insults. For someone who had healed, taught, and loved so deeply, this rejection must have been devastating. And then came the moment when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. In that moment, he bore the weight of the world's sin, experiencing a separation from God unlike anything we can comprehend. So, what did it feel like to be crucified? Imagine waves of pain radiating from every part of your body. Your arms feel like they're being pulled from their sockets. Your chest burns as you fight for every breath. Your legs cramp and throb from the strain of lifting your body. Now add to that the blazing sun, the flies buzzing around your open wounds, and the sheer humiliation of being exposed for all to see. The physical pain alone is unimaginable, but the emotional and spiritual torment made it even worse. And yet, through it all, Jesus didn't curse his tormentors. Instead, he prayed for them. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. How is that even possible? To forgive in the midst of such overwhelming pain, it's a love that defies understanding. After hours of unimaginable suffering, Jesus declared, "It is finished," John 19, verse 30, and gave up his spirit. At that moment, the earth shook, the temple veil was torn in two, and history was forever changed. He wasn't just talking about his suffering. He was declaring victory over sin and death. The cross, brutal as it was, became the instrument of our salvation. Through his sacrifice, Jesus bridged the gap between humanity and God, offering us a way to be reconciled. But why did it have to be so brutal? Why didn't God choose a quicker, less painful death? Because the cross wasn't just about death, it was about demonstrating the depth of God's love for us. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The brutality of the cross reflects the seriousness of our sin and the immeasurable cost of our redemption. The cross isn't just a historical event, it's personal. Jesus endured its brutality for you, for me, for everyone. When we reflect on the pain and suffering he went through, it should remind us of the incredible love. Whatever pain or struggle you're facing, remember that Jesus understands. He's been there. And because of what he endured, you can find hope, healing, and forgiveness. The cross was brutal, yes, but it was also beautiful, a symbol of sacrifice, redemption, and victory. Jesus turned an instrument of death into a doorway to eternal life. If this story has touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. And remember, the same love that held Jesus to the cross is the love that holds you in his arms today. Let's be honest, most of us aren't facing fiery furnaces or lion pits, but life still throws challenges our way. Maybe it's standing up for your beliefs at school or work, or maybe it's enduring a tough situation with faith and grace. The question is, Will you stand firm like Daniel or Stephen? Will you trust God, even when the odds are stacked against you? The Bible's stories of torture and suffering aren't just about pain. They're about perseverance, faith, and the ultimate victory of good over evil. They remind us that even in the darkest moments, God is with us. So, whether you are facing lions, flames, or just the challenges of daily life, hold on to your faith.
That we do. Many seem to be confused because they do not understand the book of Revelation. However, what if there was an animation showing the entire book? Well, we created that. And to watch that, click here.